Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, California. In October 1959, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was in his 7th year of a 15-year sentence at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, the maximum security prison sitting on an island in San Francisco Bay that held some of America's most dangerous criminals. Johnson was 54 years old, serving time for federal narcotics conspiracy. He was one of approximately 260 inmates locked up on the Rock, a place where escape was considered impossible and where violence quietly boiled just beneath the surface of enforced routine and strict discipline. Johnson had arrived at Alcatraz in June 1953, and by October 1959, he had built a reputation as someone who deserved respect. He was a former Harlem crime boss who had controlled millions of dollars in illegal gambling operations. He had survived decades of gang wars. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that earned him respect from other inmates, regardless of their race or criminal background. Among black prisoners especially, Johnson was a legend. He was a man who had built an empire in Harlem, who had stood up to Italian mob families, and who represented black power and black success in a world that was dominated by white criminal organizations. But not everyone at Alcatraz respected Bumpy Johnson. And one man in particular, a massive white prisoner named Eric Polson, would learn in the most violent and permanent way possible that disrespecting Johnson carried consequences that no amount of size, strength, or murderous reputation could protect against. According to 17 former Alcatraz inmates who were present during October 1959, and who spoke with prison chroniclers between 1,965 and 1,970, what happened in the prison cafeteria on October 23, 1959, became the most legendary act of violence in Alcatraz history. Not because of how brutal it was. Alcatraz had seen far more brutal attacks, but because of how fast it happened, how carefully it was carried out, and how completely it put an end to racist harassment that had been building for an entire week. Eric Polson, 38 years old in October 1959, was exactly the kind of prisoner that Alcatraz was designed to hold. Violent, cruel, racist, and completely without regret about any of it. Polson stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed approximately 275 pounds of solid muscle, built through years of prison weightlifting. He had been convicted of 3 separate murders, all of black men committed during armed robberies in Texas between 1954 and 1956. According to court records and prison files, Polson had specifically targeted black victims because, in his own words during his trial, killing a black person was not really murder, it was pest control. He showed no remorse during his sentencing, laughed when the judge called him a racist monster, and promised he would kill more black people if he ever got out of prison. Alcatraz received Polson in 1957 after he had attacked multiple black prisoners at other federal facilities, making him too dangerous to keep in regular prisons. At Alcatraz, Polson continued his pattern of racist violence and intimidation, but in a more calculated way, one that avoided the kind of obvious attacks that would land him in solitary confinement indefinitely. Polson was smart about how he terrorized people, says Marcus Williams, a black inmate who served at Alcatraz from 1958 to 1964 and who witnessed the incident involving Johnson. Williams spoke with Prison Chronicles in 1968. He didn't just attack people out in the open where guards would see. He would do small things that humiliated and intimidated people, but weren't technically violent enough to get him thrown in the hole. He would take food off black prisoners' trays during meals. He would bump into black prisoners in the shower or in the yard, making it look like an accident, but doing it hard enough to hurt. He would whisper racial slurs when guards weren't close enough to hear. He made it very clear that he considered black prisoners to be beneath him, that he thought Alcatraz was too good for them, that they should all be working in fields or cleaning toilets rather than being housed alongside white criminals who had committed what he called real crimes. By October 1959, Polson had been at Alcatraz for 2 years and had established himself as someone who intimidated most prisoners, not just black inmates, but even white inmates who didn't want to risk a confrontation with someone that large and that violent. Guards put up with Polson's behavior to a certain extent because he was smart enough not to cross the line into attacks that would require serious punishment, and because some guards, though this was never officially acknowledged, shared Polson's racist views and quietly approved of the way he kept black prisoners in what he called their place. Polson thought he was untouchable, Williams recalls. He had killed 3 black men on the outside and felt no guilt about it. He was bigger and stronger than almost anyone at Alcatraz, and he had been getting away with his intimidation tactics for 2 years without facing any serious consequences. So when Bumpy Johnson arrived in 1953 and earned respect among other prisoners, Polson saw that as a challenge. He saw this older black man, Bumpy, was 54 in October 1959, while Polson was only 38, getting respect from both black and white prisoners. And Polson couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand seeing a black man being treated like he mattered. So Polson decided he was going to humiliate Bumpy, break him down, and show everyone that no black man was above being put in his place by a white man who considered himself superior. The escalating confrontation between Eric Polson and Bumpy Johnson began on Friday, October 16, 1959, during the lunch meal period in Alcatraz's main cafeteria. According to witnesses, Johnson was sitting at a table with 3 other black inmates eating quietly when Polson walked past carrying his own tray. Without breaking stride, Polson reached down and took Johnson's dessert, a small piece of apple pie that was part of the standard meal, and kept walking to his own table, where he sat down and ate the pie while staring at Johnson with obvious contempt. According to witnesses, Johnson looked at the spot where his dessert had been, looked at Polson eating it, and then went back to eating his own meal, without any visible reaction. Everyone at Bumpy's table was ready to fight, Williams recalls. We were ready to stand up and confront Polson for disrespecting Bumpy like that. But Bumpy just shook his head slightly, telling us to stay calm, and kept eating like nothing had happened. We didn't understand at first. We thought maybe Bumpy was afraid of Polson because Polson was so big, but later we understood. Bumpy was giving Polson rope to hang himself. Bumpy was letting Polson believe he could get away with this respect, so that Polson would keep pushing further and further until he crossed the line where Bumpy could respond with overwhelming violence that would be justified as self-defense. The second incident happened on Monday, October 19th, in the communal shower area. Johnson was showering when Polson walked in, went directly toward Johnson despite plenty of other shower stations being available, and shoved Johnson hard enough that Johnson slipped on the wet floor and had to catch himself against the wall to avoid falling. "That's my shower," Polson said loudly enough for everyone in the shower area to hear clearly. "Find another one. This one's for white men only." According to witnesses, Johnson slowly stood up straight, water dripping from his body, and looked at Polson for several seconds without saying a word. Then Johnson simply moved to a different shower station and finished washing without saying anything or showing any anger. Again, everyone watching thought Bumpy was being weak, Williams says. Polson had just physically shoved him and used a racial slur, and Bumpy just walked away. But those of us who knew Bumpy's reputation understood what he was doing. He was making Polson feel confident. He was making Polson think Bumpy was an easy target who could be pushed around, and that confidence would make Polson careless. The third incident happened on Wednesday, October 21st, during the outdoor recreation period when inmates were allowed in the prison yard for 1 hour. Johnson was walking the outer edge of the yard with 2 other inmates when Polson deliberately stepped into their path. "Get out of my way," Polson said, standing directly in front of Johnson. "I walk straight. You walk around. That's how it works in here. White men walk straight." He used a racial slur to refer to Johnson and the other black inmates. According to witnesses, Johnson looked at Polson for a moment, then simply stepped off the path and walked around him without responding to the slur or the confrontation. Polson laughed loudly and called after Johnson, "That's right. You know your place. You keep walking around white men like you're supposed to." By Wednesday evening, October 21st, everyone at Alcatraz was talking about the confrontations between Polson and Johnson. Some inmates thought Johnson was showing weakness by not standing up to Polson's provocations. Others, particularly older inmates who understood prison politics better, suspected Johnson was planning something and was simply waiting for the right moment. "I talked to Bumpy Wednesday night in our cell block," Williams recalls. "I asked him why he wasn't standing up to Polson, and Bumpy smiled slightly and said, 'I'm giving him enough rope to hang himself. Right now, if I attack him, guards will see it as me starting a fight, and I'll go to solitary. But if I let him keep pushing, eventually he'll do something that crosses the line, and then I can respond in a way that guards will understand was justified. Be patient. This will resolve itself very soon.'" The final escalation occurred on Thursday, October 22nd, the day before the cafeteria incident that would become legendary. During the afternoon recreation period, Polson approached a young black inmate named Robert Jackson, 23 years old, who was sitting alone on a bench reading a book. "What are you reading, boy?" Polson asked, snatching the book out of Jackson's hands. "Are there pictures in it?" "I didn't know black people could read words without pictures." According to witnesses, Jackson, who was small, maybe 140 pounds, serving time for postal fraud, and had never been violent in his life, tried to politely take his book back. "Please give that back, sir. I was reading it." Polson responded by hitting Jackson across the face with the book, knocking Jackson off the bench and onto the ground, and then throwing the book into a puddle of dirty water that had collected near a drain. "That's what I think of black people who think they're smart enough to read," Polson said, standing over Jackson, who was holding his face where he had been hit. "You're not smart. You're not equal to white men. You belong on the ground where I just put you." Guards broke up the confrontation before it went any further, but they did not punish Polson severely. He received a verbal warning and lost 1 day of recreation privileges. Jackson was sent to the infirmary with a split lip and a black eye. That evening, Bumpy Johnson sat with several other black inmates in their cell block. According to Williams, who was present, Johnson made a statement that everyone understood meant something was going to happen very soon. "Tomorrow at lunch, Polson is going to learn a lesson he'll remember for the rest of his life. I've been patient. I've let him think he can disrespect me without consequences. I've let him think that being big and violent makes him untouchable. But tomorrow, he's going to understand that size doesn't matter when someone has the intelligence and the willingness to use violence more strategically than he does. Tomorrow, Alcatraz is going to see what happens when a racist bully picks the wrong target." The main cafeteria at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary seated approximately 250 inmates at long tables arranged in rows, with guards stationed at key positions around the edges, watching for any signs of trouble. Meals were highly structured. Inmates filed in, received their food, sat at assigned tables, ate in silence or with very little conversation, and filed out within 45 minutes. Violence during meals was relatively rare because guards had a clear view of every table, and because inmates knew that starting a fight in the cafeteria would result in immediate solitary confinement. On Friday, October 23rd, 1959, at approximately 12:15 in the afternoon, inmates filed into the cafeteria for lunch. Bumpy Johnson, wearing the standard prison clothing, received his food tray and walked to his assigned table, where he sat down with 3 other inmates and began eating quietly. Eric Polson entered the cafeteria 2 minutes later, received his tray, and instead of walking to his own assigned table, walked directly to Johnson's table and sat down in an empty seat across from Johnson, setting his tray down with deliberate force. "Well, well," Polson said, loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "If it isn't Harlem's king. Still eating with your friends, I see. Still thinking you're somebody important, instead of just another man who belongs in a cage." According to witnesses, Johnson continued eating without looking up, without acknowledging Polson's presence or his racial slurs. This non-response seemed to anger Polson, who wanted a reaction. "You ignoring me, boy?" Polson said, leaning forward across the table toward Johnson. "You think you're too good to respond when a white man talks to you? Let me explain something. You're beneath me. That means when I talk to you, you respond respectfully, or you face consequences." Polson then turned his attention to Robert Jackson, the young inmate he had hit with a book the day before, who was sitting 3 tables away. Jackson's face still showed bruising from where Polson had struck him. "Hey, boy," Polson shouted across the cafeteria at Jackson. "How's your face feeling today? Did you learn your lesson about reading books you're not smart enough to understand? Maybe I need to come over there and teach you another lesson." Jackson, according to witnesses, looked down at his food, trying to avoid Polson's attention, clearly terrified. Some of the other black inmates at Jackson's table started to stand up, preparing to defend him if Polson came over. But guards shouted for everyone to remain seated. And then Bumpy Johnson stood up. According to all 17 witnesses who saw what happened next, the entire sequence of events lasted approximately 3 to 4 seconds. Johnson rose from his seat at the table, and as he stood, his right hand moved to his waist where his prison shirt was tucked into his pants. In one smooth motion so fast that most witnesses didn't clearly see it happen, Johnson pulled something out from where it had been hidden against his body. It was a blade approximately 4 inches long, made from a piece of metal that had been sharpened down to a razor edge, a weapon that in prison language was called a shank, and that experienced inmates could make from various materials and hide in ways that even careful searches often missed. Johnson walked around the table toward where Polson was sitting, moving quickly but not running, covering the 8 feet between them in approximately 2 seconds. Polson saw Johnson coming and started to stand up, his hands moving to defend himself or to attack. But Johnson was faster. Johnson's right arm moved in a horizontal slash across Polson's face, from left to right, a motion that took less than 1 second. The blade cut a deep gash across Polson's face from his left cheekbone to his right jaw, opening a wound approximately 7 inches long that immediately began pouring blood. Polson screamed, a sound witnesses described as shock and pain combined, and his hands flew to his face, trying to stop the blood that was now flowing down his neck and onto his prison shirt. But Johnson was not finished. Before guards could react, before Polson could defend himself, before anyone could step in, Johnson's arm moved again. This time, it was an upward diagonal slash from lower right to upper left, and the blade cut another deep gash across Polson's face. This second cut crossed the first wound at an angle and caught Polson's right eye, slicing through the eyelid and into the eye itself. Polson collapsed backward, falling over the bench he had been sitting on and landing on the cafeteria floor in a spreading pool of his own blood, screaming continuously, his hands covering his destroyed eye, blood pouring through his fingers. The entire cafeteria erupted into chaos. Guards rushed toward the scene, blowing whistles and shouting orders for everyone to get down on the floor. Inmates scattered or dove under tables. Within 15 seconds, 5 guards had surrounded Johnson with their weapons drawn, while 2 other guards went to Polson, who was writhing on the floor with blood pooling around him from both facial wounds. Johnson dropped the blade on the floor, held his hands up to show he was no longer armed, and allowed guards to force him to the ground and handcuff him without any resistance. But before guards could drag Johnson away, before they could check his pulse or get him medical attention, Johnson said one sentence that every witness heard clearly, a sentence that would be repeated in prisons all across America for the next 50 years. "Touch that young brother again. Call him one more racial slur. And next time you won't visit a doctor, you'll visit God." Eric Polson survived the attack, but he was permanently disfigured and partially blinded. The first slash across his face required 127 stitches and left a scar running from his left cheekbone all the way to his right jaw, a mark he would carry for the rest of his life. The second slash destroyed his right eye completely, requiring emergency surgery to remove what remained of the eyeball and leaving Polson permanently blind on his right side. Polson was transferred to the prison hospital where he remained for 2 weeks recovering from his injuries. According to medical staff who treated him, Polson was a changed man after the attack, quiet, withdrawn, and no longer aggressive or threatening. The physical damage was severe, but the psychological damage was perhaps even worse. Polson had believed himself to be untouchable because of his size and his violent reputation, and Johnson had destroyed that belief in 3 seconds. Polson never threatened another black prisoner after that attack, says Williams. He had learned what every bully eventually learns if they live long enough. Size and strength don't matter. When someone has a weapon and the willingness to use it without hesitation, Paulson had shown everyone at Alcatraz that being 275 pounds of muscle meant nothing against someone who understood violence at a deeper level, who could strike faster than you could defend yourself, and who could permanently damage you before you even realized you were in danger. Bumpy Johnson was immediately placed in solitary confinement while an investigation was carried out. The investigation lasted 2 weeks and included interviews with dozens of witnesses. What investigators found was exactly what Johnson had planned for them to find. Multiple witnesses testified that Paulson had been harassing and threatening black prisoners for weeks, including taking Johnson's food, shoving Johnson in the showers, blocking Johnson's path in the yard, and using racial slurs constantly. Witnesses testified that Paulson had physically assaulted Robert Jackson the day before the cafeteria incident, hitting him with a book, knocking him to the ground, and calling him racial slurs. Witnesses testified that on the day of the attack, Paulson had sat down at Johnson's table without being invited, had repeatedly used racial slurs toward Johnson, and had then shouted threats at Jackson across the cafeteria. Johnson's own statement to investigators was simple and consistent. "I defended myself and another inmate from a racist prisoner who had been threatening us for a week. I used the minimum force necessary to make sure he would stop threatening us. I had warned him. I told him after the attack that if he continued his behavior, the consequences would be worse next time. I don't regret defending myself. I don't regret defending Robert Jackson. I regret that violence was necessary, but it was necessary because guards were not protecting us from Paulson's harassment." After 2 weeks in solitary confinement, prison officials made a decision that surprised many people. Johnson would serve additional time in solitary 30 days total for possession of a weapon and for assault. But he would not have extra years added to his sentence because investigators concluded that Johnson had been pushed into it by Paulson's ongoing harassment, and that the attack, while very violent, was understandable given everything that had happened. The prison administration didn't want to admit it publicly, Williams explains. But they knew Paulson had been terrorizing black inmates for years, and that guards had done nothing to stop it. They knew Paulson had assaulted Jackson the day before. They knew Paulson had walked over to Bumpy's table and was using racial slurs and threatening another inmate when Bumpy attacked him. So punishing Bumpy too harshly would mean admitting that the prison administration had failed to protect inmates from a known racist bully. Instead, they gave Bumpy 30 days in solitary enough punishment to satisfy the rules against weapons and violence, and then quietly transferred Paulson to another facility when he recovered, which was essentially their way of admitting that Paulson was the problem, not Bumpy. What happened in Alcatraz's cafeteria on October 23rd, 1959 became legendary not just at Alcatraz, but in federal prisons all across America. Inmates who were transferred from Alcatraz to other facilities carried the story with them. Guards talked about it, prison officials wrote about it in their reports, and the story grew with every retelling until it became a legend that defined Bumpy Johnson's reputation for the rest of his time in prison and for the rest of his life. The legend highlighted several key elements. The first was his strategic patience. Johnson had endured a full week of harassment without responding, letting Paulson grow confident and careless, waiting for the moment when a response would be justified. The second was speed and precision, 2 slashes in 3 seconds that permanently disfigured and partially blinded a man before guards could react, or before the victim could defend himself. The third was the weapon. Nobody knew where Johnson had hidden the blade, or how he had gotten it into the cafeteria. That mystery added to the legend, suggesting that Johnson had abilities and resources that other inmates simply could not match. The fourth was the message itself. Touch that young brother again, and next time you'll visit God. That statement became famous in prison culture as the perfect threat, specific, clear, and completely believable, coming from someone who had just shown the willingness and the ability to inflict devastating violence. The fifth element was the age factor. Johnson was 54 years old when he attacked Paulson, while Paulson was 38 and significantly larger physically. The fact that an older, smaller man had destroyed a younger, bigger man so quickly and so efficiently became a central part of the legend, proving that intelligence and experience were worth far more than size and physical strength. The legend of what Bumpy did to Polson spread through every federal prison in America within a year, says Williams. Inmates in Atlanta and Leavenworth and Marion were talking about it. Black inmates especially saw it as justice. One of their own standing up to a racist bully and permanently ending that bullying in a way that guards never could or would. The story became an inspiration. If you're being harassed by racists, if you're being threatened by people who think they're untouchable, remember what Bumpy Johnson did at Alcatraz. Be patient. Be strategic. And when the moment is right, respond with overwhelming force that ends the threat permanently. When Johnson was released from solitary confinement after 30 days, he returned to the general prison population and found that his reputation had changed completely. According to Williams and other inmates, white racist prisoners who had previously felt comfortable using racial slurs around black inmates now kept their mouths shut when Johnson was nearby, understanding that crossing him could result in permanent disfigurement. Young black inmates treated Johnson with deep respect, seeing him as someone who had defended one of them against a racist bully when no one else would or could. Even the guards showed more respect, understanding that Johnson was not just another inmate, but someone who could and would use careful, strategic violence when necessary to protect himself and others. After the Polson incident, nobody messed with Bumpy Johnson at Alcatraz, Williams says. Nobody took his food. Nobody pushed him in the showers. Nobody used racial slurs around him. The word had spread. Bumpy Johnson might be 54 years old, might look like an aging criminal who is past his prime, but he is more dangerous than men half his age because he is smarter, more patient, and willing to use violence with surgical precision when he needs to. That reputation protected Bumpy for his remaining 4 years at Alcatraz until his release in 1963. And it protected every black inmate at Alcatraz because racists understood that if they targeted black prisoners, they might face retaliation from Bumpy, and nobody wanted that. Robert Jackson, the 23-year-old inmate Polson had been threatening when Johnson stepped in, served the rest of his sentence at Alcatraz, and was released in 1962. According to Jackson's later account shared with friends and family, the cafeteria incident changed his life by teaching him about courage, justice, and standing up to bullies. "Mr. Johnson saved me that day," Jackson told his family after his release, according to accounts shared with Prison Chronicles. "Polson had been terrorizing me for weeks. I'm small. I'm not violent. I couldn't defend myself against someone that big. I thought I would have to put up with his abuse for my entire sentence. And then Mr. Johnson, who barely knew me, who had no obligation to help me, stood up and permanently ended the threat in 3 seconds. He risked additional prison time to defend me. He used violence on my behalf when I couldn't use it myself. That taught me that there are people in this world who will stand up for you when you can't stand up for yourself, and that justice sometimes requires violence when peaceful means have failed." Jackson never saw Johnson again after they were both released from Alcatraz. But Jackson kept a newspaper clipping about Johnson's 1968 death. And at Jackson's own funeral in 1997, his family found the clipping in Jackson's wallet, along with a handwritten note that read, "He saved me when no one else would. He showed me what courage looks like. RJ 1962. Eric Polson was transferred from Alcatraz to USP Leavenworth in Kansas in December 1959, 2 months after the cafeteria attack. According to prison records and accounts from inmates who served alongside Polson at Leavenworth, Polson was a changed man after his encounter with Johnson, physically disfigured with a massive facial scar and blind in one eye, but also psychologically broken by the realization that his size and violence had not protected him. Polson served the rest of his sentence at Leavenworth and was released in 1971. He returned to Texas, worked various manual labor jobs, and died in 1989 at the age of 68. According to people who knew him in Texas, Polson rarely spoke about his time in prison. But when he did, he would touch the scar on his face, a mark that remained clearly visible even 30 years after Johnson had put it there, and say, "I learned the hard way that being big doesn't make you tough, and being tough doesn't make you smart. I thought I was the most dangerous man at Alcatraz. Turns out I wasn't even close. Bumpy Johnson was released from Alcatraz in November 1963 after serving 10 years of his 15-year sentence. He returned to Harlem, took back control of his criminal empire, and lived until July 1968, when he died of a heart attack at the age of 62. But the story of what Johnson did to Eric Poulson in the Alcatraz cafeteria on October 23, 1959, outlived Johnson by decades. The story was told in prisons all across America. It was mentioned in books about prison culture. It was retold by former inmates who had served at Alcatraz and who wanted to pass on the legend of how one man had ended racist harassment with 2 slashes of a blade and 1 perfect threat. That cafeteria attack defined Bumpy Johnson's reputation in ways that nothing else he ever did could match, says Marcus Williams, who remained friends with Johnson after both men were released from Alcatraz. Everyone knew Bumpy had been a successful criminal in Harlem. Everyone knew he had survived gang wars and built an empire. But the Alcatraz incident showed something deeper. It showed that even at 54 years old, even after years in prison, Bumpy was still the most dangerous person in any room because he combined intelligence with an absolute willingness to use strategic violence. That combination, patience, intelligence, and overwhelming force applied at exactly the right moment, that's what made Bumpy legendary. Not the violence itself, but the strategic brilliance of how and when he used it. The phrase, "Next time you'll visit God," Johnson's warning to Poulson after the attack became one of the most quoted lines in prison culture, used by inmates across America as a way to warn potential enemies that pushing things past a certain point would result in death rather than just injury. And the legend of the attack itself, 2 cuts across the face in 3 seconds, blood everywhere, a racist bully permanently disfigured and blinded, became a warning story about what happens when bullies pick the wrong target. When racists assume that their size or their violence makes them untouchable. When prisoners forget that the quietest, oldest inmate in the room might actually be the most dangerous person in the entire facility. That was October 23rd, 1959. That was the day Eric Poulson learned that Bumpy Johnson, at 54 years old, decades past his physical prime, was still capable of violence that would make a 275-pound triple murderer scream in terror. That was the moment that became legend. The attack that showed every prisoner in America that age does not take away danger when intelligence and strategic thinking are guiding the violence. That was the 3 seconds that proved, once and for all, why you never, ever disrespect Bumpy Johnson. Because he will give you enough rope to hang yourself, and then he will cut you so fast and so precisely that you will already be bleeding before you even realize you have been attacked, and you will carry the scars of that mistake for the rest of your life.